The frozen mud crunched under Hauptmann Friedrich Weber's boots as he approached the hulking shape sitting in the Wehrmacht vehicle depot outside Paderborn. It was March 19th, 1945, and the war was collapsing around Germany like a house built on sand. But the American tank before him represented something Weber had not seen in nearly 4 years of armoured warfare, something that made his stomach tighten with a feeling he had not experienced since the early days of Operation Barbarossa, fear born of genuine technological disadvantage. The tank was an M26 Pershing, knocked out 3 days earlier during a skirmish near the Ruhr pocket. Wehrmacht recovery crews had managed to tow it back before American forces could reclaim it. The damage was relatively minor, a track blown off by a Panzerfaust, nothing that prevented examination of its primary systems. Weber had been ordered to assess this new American heavy tank, to determine what the Wehrmacht was now facing as. American armoured spearheads drove deeper into the Reich. Weber had commanded Panzer IVs in France in 1940. He had fought 34s outside Moscow in 1941. He had seen his Tiger blown out from under him at Kursk in 1943. He knew tanks. He knew what made them dangerous, what made them vulnerable, what made crews inside them live or die. But as he circled this American machine, running his hand along the sloped glacis plate, he could not shake the unsettling realization that was forming in his mind. The Americans had finally built a tank that could match, perhaps exceed, Germany's best. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The intelligence briefings had been vague, almost dismissive. American heavy tank, approximately 45 tons, armed with a 90mm gun. The reports made it sound like an upgraded Sherman, nothing the Wehrmacht had not seen before. But standing next to this machine, Weber understood immediately that the intelligence officers in Berlin had either not understood what they were looking at or had chosen to downplay the threat. This was not an upgraded Sherman. This was something entirely different. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter climbed out of the turret hatch, his face pale despite the cold. Richter was Weber's most experienced gunner, a veteran of the Afrika Korps, who had served under Rommel before being transferred to the Eastern Front. He had fired more rounds in anger than most tankers would fire in training. His assessment would be honest and accurate. "Herr Hauptmann," Richter said quietly, his breath forming clouds in the March air. "You need to see the gun." Weber pulled himself up onto the hull, the American armour cold under his hands even through his gloves. The Pershing sat lower than a Tiger, its profile more compact, but it still weighed 46 tons fully, loaded. The turret was massive, angular, and well-armoured. Weber dropped through the commander's cupola into the fighting compartment. The smell inside was different from German tanks. American lubricants, American fuel residue, American sweat. But the layout was immediately comprehensible. Commander's position on the right, gunner below, and forward, loader on the left. The gun breech dominated the turret interior, a long 90mm M3 cannon that extended far beyond the hull front. Weber had seen the specifications, but specifications on paper meant nothing compared to the reality of sitting behind this weapon. Richter was at the gunner's position, peering through the M10 periscopic sight. "The optics are excellent," he reported. "Not quite as good as our Zeiss equipment, but very close. More importantly, the traverse mechanism is fast, much faster than our Tigers. And look at this." He indicated the turret traverse controls. The system was powered, smooth, responsive. Weber knew from experience that German Tigers required tremendous physical effort to traverse the turret manually when the hydraulic system failed or when the engine was not running. This American system seemed simpler, more robust. But it was the ammunition that truly caught Weber's attention. The loader's ready rack held rounds that were larger than anything he had seen in a medium tank. The M82 armour-piercing shell weighed 24.3 pounds. The complete fixed round with propellant case weighed 42 pounds. This was a heavy tank round in every sense, designed to defeat the heaviest armour at extended ranges. Weber pulled one of the captured American technical manuals from his document case. The manual had been taken from a destroyed Sherman weeks earlier, but it contained ballistic tables for the 90mm M3 gun. His finger traced down the columns of numbers. Muzzle velocity, 2,650 feet per second. Penetration against face hardened. Armor at 1,000 yards, approximately 140 millimeters. At 2,000 yards, still over 100 millimeters. The implications were staggering. A Tiger I's frontal armor was 100 millimeters thick at most points. The glacis plate on a Tiger II was 150 millimeters, but it was sloped. The turret front on a Tiger II was 180 millimeters, but only directly forward. From the ballistic tables, Weber calculated that this American gun could penetrate a Tiger I's frontal armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. It could threaten a Tiger II's glacis at over 1,000 yards, possibly more with the newest American ammunition. "They have finally done it," Weber said quietly, more to himself than to Richter. "The Americans have built a tank that can kill our heavy tanks at the ranges where we thought we were invulnerable." Richter nodded slowly. "I commanded a Panzer IV during the French campaign. We thought we were invincible then too. We had better tanks than the French, better training, better tactics. But the French had more tanks. Many more tanks. The Americans have learned that lesson. They built thousands of Shermans, and now they are building these." Weber climbed back out of the turret and dropped to the ground. He needed to examine the armor protection. The frontal glacis was sloped at 46 degrees from vertical, approximately 4.5 inches of face-hardened armor. Not as thick as a Tiger II, but the slope provided excellent ballistic protection. American engineers had clearly studied Soviet 34 design principles. Sloped armor was more effective than vertical armor of the same thickness. The side armor was less impressive, only 3 inches, but that was common for all medium and heavy tanks. Side armor was always a compromise between protection and weight. What surprised Weber was the overall build quality. The welds were clean and consistent. The armor plate showed no signs of the metallurgical defects that had plagued German tank production since 1943, when alloy shortages began affecting steel quality. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, a maintenance specialist who had kept Tigers running on the Eastern Front through 3 winters, was examining the engine compartment. Müller knew engines the way a surgeon knew anatomy. He could diagnose problems by sound alone, could strip and rebuild a Maybach in darkness using only touch. "American Ford GAF engine," Müller called out. 8 cylinders, 500 horsepower. Similar to the engine in their M4A3 Sherman, but upgraded for the heavier weight. "The cooling system is well designed, much better than ours. Look at these radiator fans, Herr Hauptmann. They are belt-driven, simple, reliable. Our Tigers use hydraulic fans that fail constantly." Weber joined Müller at the engine deck. The American engine was not as powerful as the Maybach HL 230 in a Tiger, which produced 700 horsepower. But the Pershing weighed 46 tons compared to the Tiger's 57 tons. The power-to-weight ratio was actually slightly better on the Pershing. More importantly, the engine compartment was laid out for maintainability. Components were accessible, hoses and connections were clearly marked. The fuel system used simple, robust components, rather than the complex, temperamental systems in German tanks. Müller pointed out that the air filtration system was excellent, far superior to German designs that constantly clogged with dust and debris. "This engine will run," Müller said with certainty. "It will run reliably, for hundreds of kilometers, without the constant breakdowns we experience. The Americans have built this tank to be maintained by farm boys with basic tools, not by factory-trained specialists with specialized equipment." The transmission examination yielded similar conclusions. Where German tanks used complex synchromesh gearboxes requiring precise tolerances and careful handling, the Pershing employed a torque converter automatic transmission system. It was not as theoretically efficient as a manual transmission, but it was far more reliable and required much less driver skill to operate effectively. Weber remembered the weeks of training required to produce competent Tiger drivers. The steering system alone demanded extensive practice. The regenerative steering used in German heavy tanks required the driver to predict turns well in advance, selecting the appropriate gear for the desired turn radius. Under combat stress, inexperienced drivers often made mistakes that could be fatal. The Pershing's controls looked almost simple by comparison. The driver had a conventional steering wheel, not the complex system of levers and gears used in German tanks. The automatic transmission meant the driver did not need to manage gear changes while also controlling steering and monitoring engine conditions. An American farm boy who had driven a tractor could probably learn to operate this tank in days, not weeks. Oberst Heinrich Vogel arrived at the depot in the early afternoon. Vogel was the senior armor officer for the region, a veteran who had commanded panzer battalions in Poland, France, and Russia. He had survived Stalingrad, retreated through Ukraine, fought the delaying actions across Poland. He had seen the tide of war turn against Germany. He understood what was coming. Weber saluted and delivered his preliminary assessment. Herr Oberst, this American tank represents a fundamental shift in the balance of armored warfare. It combines the firepower of our Tiger with mobility approaching our Panther, and it appears to have been designed with reliability and maintainability as primary considerations. Vogel climbed into the turret and spent 20 minutes examining the gun, the sights, the ammunition. When he emerged, his face was grim. "Show me the ballistic tables." Weber spread the captured American. Manual on the hull deck. Vogel studied the penetration data in silence. His finger moved down the columns, comparing ranges and penetration values. Finally, he looked up. At Kursk in 1943, we believed our Tigers were nearly invincible from the front. The Soviet 76mm guns could not penetrate us at combat ranges. We could engage 34s at 2,000 meters and destroy them before they could effectively return fire. That advantage lasted less than a year. By early 1944, the Soviets had deployed 85mm guns that could threaten our frontal armor. Now the Americans have a 90mm gun that can penetrate a Tiger at ranges where we cannot effectively engage them with our own weapons. Herr Oberst, the Tiger's 88mm KWK-36 gun can penetrate approximately 112mm of armor at 1,000 meters, Weber replied. The Pershing's frontal glacis, when we account for the AQ's slope angle, provides equivalent protection of approximately 120 to 130 millimeters. The Tiger cannot reliably penetrate the Pershing's front at combat ranges, but the Pershing can penetrate the Tiger. Vogel nodded slowly. The Americans have achieved what we spent the entire war trying to maintain: technological superiority. How many of these tanks do they have? Intelligence estimates are unclear, Herr Oberst. We know that approximately 20 Pershings arrived in Europe in February. More are certainly in production. Given American industrial capacity, they can probably produce thousands of these if the war continues. The war will not continue much longer, Vogel said quietly. We are running out of fuel, ammunition, trained crews, spare parts. Even if we had 1,000 Tigers, we could not keep them operational. But the Americans can build these Pershings by the thousand, and they will actually work when needed. Over the next 2 days, Weber's team documented every aspect of the Pershing they could access, without specialized tools or test equipment. The suspension system used torsion bars, similar to German designs but with better shock absorption. The tracks were rubber-bushed, providing longer life than German dry-pin tracks. The ammunition storage was protected by water jackets that would help extinguish fires if the tank was penetrated. Lieutenant Otto Brandt, an engineer who had worked at Henschel designing Tiger components before being commissioned, examined the turret armor in detail. The face hardening on this armor is excellent, he reported. Consistent quality throughout. No brittleness, no spaulding when I test it with a hammer. Compare this to the armor plate we are receiving now from German mills. We are running out of molybdenum and other alloying elements. Our armor is becoming unreliable. Some plates shatter when hit instead of resisting penetration. Weber had seen this, himself. In January, a Panther in his battalion had been hit by a Soviet 85mm shell. The glacis plate had shattered rather than deflecting the round, and the entire crew had been killed by armor fragments and the penetrating shell. German armor quality had declined dramatically as the war's material shortages worsened. The Americans clearly did not have this problem. The Pershing's armor showed consistent quality, proper hardening, adequate ductility to resist shattering. American steel mills had access to all the alloying elements needed to produce proper armor plate. German mills were making do with substitutes and hoping for acceptable results. On the third day of examination, Weber compiled his final report. The document ran to 15 pages, with detailed sketches, measurements, and technical assessments. His conclusions were stark and unambiguous. The M26 Pershing represented American mastery of the lessons learned through 4 years of armored warfare. It combined adequate armor protection with a powerful, accurate gun. It prioritized reliability over theoretical performance maximums. It was designed to be produced in large numbers, maintained by minimally trained personnel, and operated by crews with modest skill levels. Most critically, it could defeat German heavy tanks at ranges where German tanks could not reliably return fire. Weber's report went up the chain of command. It reached senior Wehrmacht armor officers who were desperately trying to understand how to counter the flood of Allied armor pushing into Germany from both east and west. But by March 1945, there was no effective counter. Germany lacked the fuel to move the tanks it still possessed. Training of new crews had collapsed. Spare parts were unavailable. The industrial capacity to produce new tanks in meaningful numbers no longer existed. One passage from Weber's report would later be found in captured German military documents. The American M26 tank represents what we should have built in 1942, a balance of firepower, protection, and mobility, designed for mass production and reliable field operation. Instead, we built Tigers and Panthers that were magnificent in ideal conditions, but failed in the field due to complexity and inadequate logistics. We built tanks to impress engineers. The Americans built tanks to win wars. The assessment echoed comments that American engineers had made 2 years earlier when examining captured Panthers at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Both sides had now reached the same conclusion from opposite directions. Over-engineering and complexity were liabilities, not advantages. Reliability and maintainability were more valuable than theoretical performance superiority. The best tank was not the one with the most impressive specifications, but the one that actually worked when needed. German tank commanders who encountered Pershings in combat during March and April 1945 reported similar observations. The American heavy tanks were dangerous opponents that could engage at long range with their powerful 90mm guns. Panthers and Tigers that had dominated earlier battles found themselves outranged and outgunned. Hauptmann Friedrich von Rosen, commanding a company of Panther tanks near Remagen, reported engaging American armor on March 23. His after-action report noted that American tanks were firing from positions over 1,500 meters distant, achieving penetrations against his Panther's side armor when German return fire was ineffective due to range and visibility conditions. Von Rosen identified the American tanks as the new heavy type, based on their size and the distinctive muzzle brake on the 90mm gun. We could not close the range without exposing ourselves to flanking fire, von Rosen wrote. The American tanks held commanding positions and engaged us at their leisure. When we attempted to withdraw, American tanks wrote, infantry with anti-tank weapons threatened our escape routes. We lost 5 Panthers, 3 to the new American tanks, 2 to infantry anti-tank fire. None of the American tanks was destroyed. This was the reality of armored warfare in the final months of World War II in Europe. German tanks, even the theoretically superior Tigers and Panthers, were increasingly unable to operate effectively. They lacked fuel, lacked ammunition, lacked trained crews, lacked air cover, lacked the logistical support needed to sustain combat operations. American tanks, backed by overwhelming logistics, air superiority, and seemingly unlimited supplies, could dictate the terms of engagement. The Pershing's arrival in Europe came too late to significantly affect the war's outcome. Only a few hundred were produced before Germany surrendered in May 1945. But for the German tank commanders who faced them, the Pershing represented a psychological shock equal to what Allied tankers had. experienced when first encountering Tigers in Tunisia in 1942. For 3 years, German tankers had fought with the confidence that came from technological superiority. Their tanks had better guns, thicker armor, superior optics. They could engage enemy tanks at ranges where return fire was ineffective. That confidence had eroded as Soviet and Allied anti-tank weapons improved, but the psychological advantage remained. German tankers believed their Tigers and Panthers were still the best tanks in the world. The Pershing shattered that belief. Here was an American tank, produced by a nation that Germans had dismissed as mechanically inferior, that could match or exceed German heavy tanks in direct combat. The psychological impact was significant. German tank crews who had once sought combat now increasingly chose to withdraw or even abandon their vehicles when faced with overwhelming odds. Oberst Vogel's final report on the captured Pershing included a passage that captured this shift. The appearance of the M26 tank marks the end of German qualitative superiority in armored warfare. The Americans have learned to combine their quantitative advantages with qualitative improvements. They are now producing tanks that are individually superior to ours while maintaining their vast numerical superiority. Against such a combination, victory is impossible. The test firing range outside Paderborn had seen better days. The target berms were cratered from Allied bombing runs. The observation bunker's concrete walls showed spiderweb cracks from near misses, and the red flags that once marked safe firing zones now hung in tatters. But the range was still functional, and Hauptmann Weber had convinced Oberst Vogel that they needed to fire Pershing's 90mm gun to truly understand its capabilities. Getting the tank operational had required 2 days of work. Müller and his maintenance team had repaired the damaged track, checked the engine systems, and verified that the gun's recoil mechanism was undamaged. Finding ammunition had been more challenging. The knocked-out Pershing had been carrying only 12 rounds when captured, 6 armor-piercing and 6 high-explosive. It would have to be enough. Weber stood in the turret commander's position, while Richter settled into the gunner's seat. The interior was cramped with the full crew, tighter than a Tiger's turret, despite the similar external dimensions. American tankers were apparently smaller on average than their German counterparts. Richter adjusted the seat height and peered through the periscopic sight. "Target acquisition is fast," Richter commented. "The sight picture is clear. The reticle is well designed. I can see why American gunners achieve effective fire with this system." They had placed a captured Soviet T-34 hull on the range at a measured distance of 1,000 meters. The T-34's armor was approximately 45 millimeters thick on the glacis, roughly, equivalent to a German Panzer IV. It would serve as a baseline target. Further out, at 1,800 meters, they had positioned the front plate from a destroyed Panther, recovered from a battlefield and mounted on a wooden frame. Weber gave the order to fire. Richter made minor adjustments to the sight picture, his hand steady on the firing mechanism. The gun roared, the turret filling instantly with propellant smoke despite the American extraction fan that began whirring immediately. The recoil was substantial but controlled, the entire turret rocking slightly before settling. Through binoculars, Weber saw the result. The armor-piercing round had punched completely through the T-34 hull, the entry hole clean and circular, the exit hole significantly larger, with petals of torn metal radiating outward. At 1,000 meters, the 90mm gun had defeated that armor as if it were paper. "Reload," Weber ordered. The American loader's position was well designed for speed. The ready rack held rounds at the perfect angle for quick extraction. A trained crew could probably sustain a rate of fire approaching 6 rounds per minute, comparable to a Tiger. The second shot targeted the Panther glacis at 1,800 meters. This was more representative of actual combat conditions. Panther frontal armor was 80 millimeters thick at a 55-degree slope, providing excellent protection against most anti-tank weapons. German crews had learned to rely on the Panther's glacis to deflect enemy fire, angling the hull to maximize the effective thickness. Richter took more time with this shot, accounting for the range, the wind, the target angle. When he fired, Weber watched the tracer arc across the range. The hit was high, striking near the top of the armor plate. But the result was unmistakable. The armor-piercing round had penetrated, punching through 80 millimeters of sloped armor at a range where most Allied guns would have been ineffective. "Mine. Got," Richter breathed. "At that range, that should have been a deflection. The angle should have defeated the round, but it went through." Weber understood Richter's shock. Panther crews had survived battles with T-34 seconds, and Sherman's specifically because their frontal armor was nearly impenetrable at combat ranges. Soviet 76mm guns could only penetrate a Panther's glacis at close range, under 500 meters, and even then only with ideal impact angles. American 75mm Sherman guns were similarly ineffective against Panther fronts, but the Pershing's 90mm gun had just defeated that same armor at 1800 meters. The implications for German tank tactics were profound. Panthers could no longer rely on their frontal armor as absolute protection. They would have to treat Pershings the way they treated Soviet IS, two heavy tanks, as extremely dangerous opponents requiring flanking attacks or ambush tactics. They fired 2 more rounds, at the Panther plate, both from over 1600 meters. Both penetrated. The American ammunition was consistent in performance. The gun was accurate at extended ranges, and the combination of velocity and projectile design was sufficient to defeat the armor that had protected German medium tanks throughout the war's later years. Lieutenant Brandt, who had been observing from the range bunker, approached as Weber climbed out of the Pershing. "Herr Hauptmann, I need to show you something in the captured American documents." They returned to the makeshift office in the depot building. Brandt had been translating American technical manuals and field reports captured from various sources over the preceding months. He spread several documents across a table, pointing to specific sections he had marked. "The Americans have developed a new armor-piercing round for the 90mm gun," Brandt explained. "The M93 hypervelocity armor-piercing shot. It uses a tungsten carbide core and achieves muzzle velocity of approximately 3,300 feet per second. The penetration at 1,000 meters is over 200 millimeters against face-hardened armor." Weber studied the ballistic tables. 200 millimeters of penetration meant this American ammunition could defeat any German tank's armor at combat ranges. Tiger, 2 frontal armor, the thickest production armor on any World War II tank, was 180 millimeters on the turret face. The M93 round could penetrate it. "How many of these rounds have been produced?" Weber asked. "The documents are unclear, but it appears limited. The tungsten carbide core requires materials that are in high demand for other weapons. But the Americans have the industrial capacity to produce them in quantity if they choose to prioritize this ammunition." Vogel entered the room, his face drawn with exhaustion. He had spent the morning on the telephone with division headquarters, receiving updates on the TC, deteriorating tactical situation. American forces had established bridgeheads across the Rhine. Soviet armies were driving toward Berlin. The war was in its final weeks, perhaps days. Weber summarized the results. Consistent penetration of medium tank armor at 1,000 meters, penetration of Panther frontal armor at 1,800 meters, gun accuracy and crew ergonomics superior to German expectations. Vogel listened in silence, then sat heavily in a wooden chair. "It no longer matters," he said quietly. "We could write 100 reports about this American tank, and it would change nothing. We have no fuel to move our remaining panzers. We have no ammunition for sustained combat. We have crews with a few weeks of training attempting to operate vehicles that require months of experience. The Americans can field dozens of these Pershings, supported by hundreds of Shermans, all with unlimited fuel and ammunition. What can we do against that?" The question was rhetorical, but Weber answered anyway. "In 1940, we had better tanks than the French and British. Not dramatically better, but better enough. We also had superior tactics, better training, better coordination between armor, infantry, and air support. We won because we understood how to use armored forces effectively. The Americans have learned those lessons. They now have tanks equal to ours, and they have the resources and logistics we never possessed." "We taught them too well," Vogel said bitterly. "We showed them what armored warfare could accomplish when properly executed. They watched, they learned, and they built an entire military doctrine around those lessons. Now they are using our own tactics against us, but with industrial capacity we cannot match. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of aircraft engines. Everyone in the room instinctively froze, listening. The engines were unmistakably American, probably P-47, Thunderbolts on a ground attack mission. The fighters passed overhead without incident, heading east toward the front lines. But their presence was a reminder of Germany's complete loss of air superiority. That is the real difference, Vogel continued. Not the tanks themselves, but everything supporting them. American tanks operate under complete air superiority. Their supply lines are protected by fighter bombers that destroy our transport before it reaches the front. Their artillery observers fly in light aircraft that direct overwhelming fire support. Their infantry have unlimited ammunition, food, medical supplies. Even if we had better tanks, which we no longer do, we could not sustain operations against such advantages. Weber had seen this reality evolve over the past 2 years. In Russia, German armor had operated with increasingly ineffective air cover. Luftwaffe squadrons that once ruled the skies had been ground down by attrition and fuel shortages. By 1944, Soviet air forces had achieved local air superiority in many sectors. Now, in early 1945, the Luftwaffe was nearly irrelevant. American and British aircraft operated with impunity, attacking anything that moved. The psychological effect on German tank crews was significant. Tankers who once maneuvered aggressively now hesitated to leave concealment during daylight hours. Every road movement risked attack by fighter bombers equipped with rockets and bombs. Every concentration of vehicles invited devastating airstrikes. German armor had become largely nocturnal, moving at night and hiding during the day. American tanks faced no such constraints. They moved when and where they chose, supported by overwhelming air power that suppressed any German attempts at counterattack. The Pershing's arrival in this environment meant that American armored forces now combined tactical flexibility, logistical sustainability, air superiority, and individual tank quality that matched or exceeded German vehicles. Hauptmann Karl Schmidt arrived at the depot that evening. Schmidt commanded a Tiger battalion, or what remained of it. He had started the year with 42 Tigers. Attrition through combat, mechanical failure, and fuel shortages had reduced his force to 11 operational vehicles. He had heard about the captured Pershing and wanted to see it for himself. Weber gave Schmidt a complete briefing, showing him the tank, the test firing results, the captured American technical documentation. Schmidt examined everything with the careful attention of a commander who knew his life might depend on understanding this new threat. "How do we fight them?" Schmidt finally asked. "If we encounter these American tanks in combat, what tactics give us the best chance?" It was the question every German tank commander was asking. Weber had spent considerable time thinking about it. "The same tactics we use against Soviet eyes. 2 tanks. Avoid frontal engagements. Use ambush positions with clear fields of fire at long range. Target the sides and rear where armor is thinner. Coordinate with infantry anti-tank weapons. Most importantly, choose your engagements carefully and withdraw before American air power can respond." Schmidt nodded slowly. "In other words, we cannot fight them directly. We must rely on surprise, superior positioning, and rapid disengagement. These are not the tactics of a force expecting victory. These are survival tactics." "Yes," Weber agreed. "That is the reality we face." Schmidt looked at the Pershing, his expression unreadable. "In 1943 at Kursk, I commanded a Tiger and believed myself nearly invincible. We could engage Soviet tanks at 2 kilometers and destroy them before they could effectively return fire. I lost half my crew when a Soviet 85mm gun penetrated my Tiger's side armor, but I survived and was given a new tank. I believed we would win because our tanks were superior. Now I look at this American tank and realize that superiority no longer exists. We are simply trying to survive long enough to see tomorrow." The assessment was brutally honest and widely shared among German tank commanders in the war's final months. The confidence that had characterized German armored forces in earlier years had evaporated. Tank crews understood they were fighting a losing battle against overwhelming odds. Intelligence reports from other sectors confirmed that American Pershing deployments, while still limited, were expanding. The 3rd and 9th Armoured Divisions had received Pershings. Additional tanks were arriving in Europe aboard cargo ships. American tank crews were being trained on the new vehicles. Within months, if the war continued, hundreds of Pershings would be operational. German strategic planning, such as it still existed in March 1945, had no effective counter to this development. Plans for new super-heavy tanks like the Maus or E-100, irrelevant fantasies given Germany's collapsed industrial capacity. Even the existing Tiger II production was ending due to material shortages and Allied bombing of manufacturing facilities. Oberst Vogel's final report on the M26 Pershing reached Wehrmacht High Command in late March. The report was comprehensive, technically accurate, and strategically pessimistic. It concluded that German armour could no longer rely on qualitative superiority to offset Allied quantitative advantages. The Americans had closed the technological gap while maintaining their massive industrial and logistical superiority. One senior armour officer who read Vogel's report noted in his diary, "We spent 4 years developing heavier tanks with more powerful guns and thicker armour. We believed bigger and heavier was better. The Americans built a tank that is heavy enough to fight our Tigers, but light enough to be transported efficiently and supplied reliably. They understood what we did not. Wars are won by logistics as much as by technology." The final weeks of the war brought scattered reports of Pershing encounters from across the collapsing Western Front. Each report reinforced the conclusions from Weber's assessment. The American heavy tank was a formidable opponent that German armour could no longer engage with confidence of success. On April 7, 1945, near the town of Kirchborchen, a company of Panthers from the 116th Panzer Division attempted to establish a defensive line against advancing American forces. The engagement was brief and one-sided. American Pershings from the 3rd Armoured Division engaged the Panthers at ranges exceeding 1,500 metres, using their superior optics and fire control to achieve first-round hits. 3 Panthers were destroyed before the German commander ordered a withdrawal. The after-action report noted that German return fire had been ineffective due to range and poor visibility conditions. Hauptmann Werner Wolf, who had commanded one of the surviving Panthers, later described the engagement. "We could see the American tanks, but they were at the extreme range of our effective fire. Our gunner fired 3 rounds, all fell short or deflected. The American tanks fired methodically, 1 round at a time, and each round found its target. We had no chance to close the range, no opportunity to maneuver for a flank shot. We could only withdraw or die." This was the new reality of German armoured warfare. Tank commanders who had once sought combat now prioritized survival. The psychological shift was profound. German tankers no longer believed they were fighting with superior equipment. They knew they were outnumbered, outgunned, and operating without the logistical support necessary for sustained operations. The handful of German tankers who actually knocked out Pershings during the war's final weeks achieved their successes through ambush tactics, not direct engagement. On March 6th, a Panther from the 9th Panzer Division destroyed a Pershing by firing into its thinner side armour from a concealed position at close range. The engagement lasted seconds. The Panther crew fired, hit, and immediately withdrew before American infantry could respond. These isolated tactical successes could not alter the strategic situation. By mid-April, German resistance was collapsing across all fronts. Tank units that still possessed operational vehicles often lacked the fuel to move them. Crews abandoned perfectly functional tanks when supply lines were cut. The organized defense of Germany had disintegrated into scattered pockets of resistance that were systematically eliminated by overwhelming Allied forces. Hauptmann Weber's captured Pershing remained at the Paderborn depot until April 9th, when American forces overran the area. Wehrmacht personnel evacuated ahead of the American advance, destroying what equipment they could not take. The Pershing was left intact, recaptured by the same armoured division that had originally lost it. An American lieutenant examining the tank found Weber's detailed assessment report in the depot office. The report was translated and sent up the American chain of command, where it generated considerable interest. American armor officers were surprised by the thoroughness and accuracy of the German evaluation. Weber had correctly identified the Pershing's strengths and weaknesses, had accurately assessed its combat capabilities, and had drawn appropriate conclusions about its impact on armored warfare. One American armor officer who read the translated report commented, "The Germans understand what we have built. They recognize that we finally have a tank that can match their best. More importantly, they understand that we can produce these tanks in quantities they cannot match. The war is ending not because of any single weapon system, but because we have achieved superiority across every dimension of military capability." The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. By that time, approximately 320 Pershings had been delivered to Europe. Most saw no combat. The few that did engage enemy armor performed as their designers had intended, defeating German tanks at ranges where German guns were less effective. Post-war analysis of the Pershing's combat record showed mixed results. The tank had achieved its design objectives. It could defeat German heavy tanks. It was reasonably reliable. It could be maintained by field units without specialized equipment. But it had arrived too late to significantly influence the war's outcome. Had Pershings been available in 1943 or even early 1944, their impact might have been substantial. By early 1945, Germany's military collapse was inevitable regardless of any individual weapon system. Hauptmann Weber survived the war. He was captured by American forces in April and spent several months in a prisoner of war camp before being released. In interviews conducted decades later, he reflected on his examination of the captured Pershing. "I knew when I saw that tank that we had lost the technological race. The Americans had learned everything we could teach them about armored warfare, and they had the resources to implement those lessons on a scale we could never match." The Pershing was not just a tank, it was proof that American industry and American engineering had reached parity with, and in some ways exceeded, anything Germany could produce. Klaus Richter, Weber's gunner, survived as well. He returned to civilian life and rarely spoke about his wartime experiences. In a brief interview in 1978, he offered a simple assessment. "The Pershing was a very good tank. If I had been given the choice between commanding a late-war Panther or a Pershing, I would have chosen the Pershing. Better gun, more reliable, better supported. The Americans built what we should have built." Oberst Heinrich Vogel died in Soviet captivity in 1947. His reports on the Pershing, along with thousands of other German military documents, were captured and studied by both American and Soviet forces. The technical assessments informed post-war tank development in both nations. The Soviet Union accelerated development of tanks with larger guns and improved armor. The United States continued refining the Pershing design, eventually producing the M26 E2 and M46 Patton variants that served through the Korean War. The broader lesson from the German examination of the captured Pershing transcended the specific technical details. German armor doctrine had evolved from the successful blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 through 1941 to favor increasingly heavy, complex, over-engineered vehicles. Tigers and Panthers were magnificent machines when they worked, but they required extensive maintenance, consumed enormous quantities of fuel, and could only be produced in limited numbers. The Americans had taken a different path. The Sherman tank that formed the backbone of American armored forces was deliberately designed for mass production, ease of maintenance, and logistical sustainability. When American tankers encountered Tigers and Panthers and found themselves outgunned, the response was not to build increasingly complex supertanks. The response was to build the Pershing, a tank with sufficient capability to fight German heavy tanks, but simple enough to be produced in quantity and maintained by field units. This fundamental difference in design philosophy reflected deeper differences in military doctrine and national resources. Germany, with limited industrial capacity and chronic resource shortages, attempted to compensate through technological superiority. America, with vast industrial capacity and secure supply lines, built weapons that prioritized reliability and producibility while maintaining adequate combat capability. The M26 Pershing represented the culmination of American learning through 4 years of armored warfare. It incorporated lessons from every theater: the North African campaigns that showed the need for better anti-tank guns, the Italian fighting that demonstrated the value of heavy armor, the Normandy hedgerows that proved the importance of infantry support weapons, and the final drive into Germany that required tanks capable of defeating Tigers and Panthers in direct combat. German tankers who examined or fought against Pershings in 1945 recognized immediately what American engineers had achieved. The United States had built a tank that balanced all the competing requirements of armored warfare: firepower, protection, mobility, reliability, maintainability, and producibility. It was not perfect in any single dimension, but it was very good in all of them. That balance, more than any single spectacular capability, made it a formidable weapon. In the end, Hauptmann Weber's assessment proved accurate. The Pershing represented what German engineers should have designed in 1942: a practical, balanced, producible tank capable of defeating the best enemy armor while remaining logistically sustainable. Instead, Germany had pursued increasingly extreme designs that were magnificent on paper but failed in practice due to complexity, fragility, and impossible logistical demands. The American 90mm gun that so impressed German evaluators became the standard armament for American heavy tanks through the 1950s. The torsion bar suspension, the automatic transmission, the emphasis on reliability over maximum theoretical performance all became hallmarks of American tank design. The Pershing's legacy extended far beyond World War II, influencing tank development through the Cold War and beyond. For the German tankers who faced Pershings in combat during the war's final months, the American heavy tank represented something more than just another enemy weapon. It symbolized the complete reversal of fortunes that had occurred since 1939. The confident, technologically superior Wehrmacht that had conquered most of Europe had been ground down by attrition, outproduced by superior industrial capacity, and finally surpassed technologically by enemies who had learned from their defeats. The 90mm gun that could penetrate Tiger armor at 2,000 yards was not just a technical achievement, it was the physical embodiment of American determination to learn from setbacks, adapt to challenges, and ultimately prevail through a combination of industrial might, technological innovation, and tactical flexibility. German tankers who had once believed their Tigers were invincible understood, perhaps better than anyone, what the Pershing represented: the end of German armored superiority and the beginning of a new era in mechanized warfare. When Hauptmann Weber walked away from the captured Pershing for the last time in April 1945, he knew the war was lost, not because of any single tank, but because the Pershing was proof that Germany no longer held any advantages that could offset the overwhelming material superiority of its enemies. The Americans had caught up technologically while maintaining their vast numerical and logistical advantages. Against such a combination, no amount of courage, skill, or tactical brilliance could secure victory. The M26 Pershing arrived too late to change World War II's outcome, but not too late to change the minds of the German tankers who faced it. They understood, in those final chaotic weeks of the war, that the Americans had finally built a tank worthy of respect. And respect, from enemies who had once considered American armor inferior, was perhaps the highest compliment the Pershing could receive. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen. Now, and don't forget to subscribe.